Yes, ma'am. You may have a seat, sir. And sir, if you would please speak into the microphone, state your first and last name and spell your first and last name. Joseph Davis, JosepPhDavis. Miss Hoffman, your witness. Good morning, Mr. Davis. Do you go by any other nicknames? Porky. Where are you from originally? Greenmount, 20th Street, around that area. Have you lived in Oh, I'm sorry. If you could, I'm being told your voice is a little quiet. Can you pull the microphone towards your face a little bit? Thank you. Have you lived in Baltimore most of your life? Yes, ma'am. How old are you now? 41. Are you currently in the custody of the U.S. Marshals awaiting sentencing in a criminal case? Yes, ma'am. Can you tell the members of the jury how you came to be arrested? I was standing on a corner and police was watching me on the camera and they came and searched me and found a handgun on me and found drugs in the yard. And which corner were you on at the time? North Avenue and Greenmount. What were you charged with? Possession of a handgun, convicted felon in possession of a handgun, and drug trafficking, and possession of marijuana, heroin, and cocaine. Were you charged initially in state court? Yes, ma'am. And were you ultimately charged for the same crimes in federal court? Yes, ma'am. Did you plead guilty in that federal case? Yes, ma'am. And when you pled guilty, did you enter into a plea agreement with the government? Yes, ma'am. As part of that agreement, did you agree to cooperate with law enforcement? Yes, ma'am. Does part of your agreement with the government require you to testify truthfully as a witness in this case? Yes, ma'am. What is your understanding of the benefit you will get if you testify truthfully? Reduction in my points. Is it your hope that you'll get a lesser sentence? Yes, ma'am. And does your eligibility for a sentencing reduction depend in any way on what happens to the defendants in this case? Object, Your Honor. Leading. Yes. Sustained. Next question. Under your plea agreement, what would happen if the government found out that you testified untruthfully? Perjury. Charge of perjury. And what would happen to your plea agreement? It would be abolished. It would be taken away. Abolished. Your Honor, I couldn't hear. Taken away. Abolished. Abolished. Is that be taken away? It would be taken away. Next question. Under your plea agreement, what would happen if the government found out that you exaggerated? That I would be charged with perjury also? And what would happen to your plea agreement? Be taken away. Has anyone made you any guarantees about what your sentence will be in this case? No, ma'am. And who is responsible for ultimately determining your sentence? The judge. When you pled guilty in this case, was that your first criminal conviction? No, ma'am. Were you convicted of a drug crime when you were 17 years old? Yes, ma'am. And when you were 18 years old, were you convicted of a violent crime? Yes, ma'am. What crime was that? Malicious wounding. I'm sorry, Your Honor. I couldn't hear. Malicious wounding. What sentence did you receive in that case? I received 19 years. When did you finish serving that sentence? In Virginia, 2010. You said in Virginia. Was it a Virginia criminal conviction? Yes, ma'am. Did you move back to Baltimore after you finished your sentence in 2010? Yes, ma'am. Where in Baltimore did you move to? I moved to North Avenue and Poplar Grove when I first came back to Baltimore. And where is Poplar Grove in relation to North and Greenmount? It's like North Avenue and Poplar Grove is like West Baltimore, and it's not that far, but it's like on the same block. As far as like North Avenue, it's probably like a good 20 blocks down. Did you eventually move back to the Greenmount and North area? Yes, ma'am. Did you eventually go back to selling drugs in that area? Yes, ma'am. Were you convicted of possession with intent to distribute marijuana in 2012? Yes, ma'am. And when did you finish your sentence for the marijuana conviction? I was sentenced to probation and it was like 2012. I finished in 2012. Okay, were you back on the streets by summer 2012? Yes, ma'am. And did you return to that Greenmount and North area again? Yes. Objection, Your Honor. Basis. The leading. Overruled. Mr. Davis, are you familiar with the gang, the Black Gorilla Family, or BGF? Yes, ma'am. And when you moved back to the Greenmount neighborhood, was there a BGF regime in that neighborhood? Yes, ma'am. Were you a member of BGF at that time? No, ma'am. Were you able to tell when others in the neighborhood were in BGF? Were there signs or symbols that they used? I couldn't really tell the signs and symbols because they was real secretive, but you could tell like how they hung together and how they came around trying to run people away from their neighborhood or rob people or what so forth. Did you have some friends who were actually in that BGF regime? Yes, ma'am. And did they ever tell you about the goings on of objection, foundation, sustained? Who were some of your friends in the BGF regime there? It was TJ, a guy named Tay. I used to socialize with a guy named Stymie also. Did you learn about the BGF regime from TJ, Tay, and Stymie? Well, TJ. Did you learn about who some of the other members in that BGF regime were from your friends, TJ, and the others you mentioned? Asked and answered, Your Honor. Overruled. You can answer, Mr. Davis. Yes, ma'am. And can you name some of the people who you learned to be in that BGF Greenmount regime? It was Roscoe, Jeezy, Stymie, Lil. It was Sneak. That's the three that I knew of. Okay, I'm going to show you some pictures. I'm going to start with Government's Exhibit PHI, as in Photos of Individuals, number 46. Who are we looking at here? Jeezy. And is he sitting here in the courtroom today? Yes, ma'am. Can you point him out for the record? Can you identify an article of clothing he's wearing? A gray sweater. Record will reflect the witness has identified the defendant Johnson without objection. You mentioned that Jeezy was one of the people in the BGF Greenmount regime. Is that right? Yes, ma'am. Did you have an understanding of what Jeezy's role in that regime was? I don't really know his. Objection, Your Honor. His answer to the question she asked him and he doesn't know. Next question. Did you see Jeezy interacting with other members of BGF in the area? Yes, ma'am. And based on seeing those interactions between Jeezy and other members of BGF, did you gain an understanding of what his role was in the regime? Like he was basically, objection, overruled. You may answer. He was basically kind of like running it for real, basically. Did you ever see him direct other members of BGF what to do? Yeah, the younger guys like Lil Wesley and all of them. Yes, ma'am. Did you ever see him text other members of the regime? I didn't actually see him text individuals, but we was in the building one time and he was like, we was in there selling drugs and he was like, yeah, I'm going to start taxing you all. You all are going to start paying taxes around here. And what did he mean by taxes? Objection. What did you understand him to mean by taxes? To pay. Overruled. You may answer. To pay certain fees. We were selling drugs in that area to pay certain fees to be around that area to sell drugs. I'm going to show you Government's Exhibit PHI 27. Who are we looking at here? Roscoe. And I believe you mentioned earlier that he was also a member of the BGF Greenmount regime. Yes, ma'am. And do you know whether he had any familial relationship with anyone else in that regime? Yes, ma'am. That's Jeezy's brother. Going to show you government's exhibit PHI 45. Do you recognize this individual? Yes, ma'am. Who is it? David. And based on your interactions with members of the BGF regime, did you learn whether he was a member of that regime? Yes, ma'am. And was he? Yes, ma'am. Showing you now government's exhibit PHI 9. Who are we looking at here? Slay. That's Lord Wesley. Objection, Your Honor. Basis. Just blurting out a name. Overruled. You may answer. That's Little Wesley. And is this the Little Wes who you mentioned before, who you saw was one of the people Jeezy would tell what to do? Yes, ma'am. Did you ever observe him selling drugs in their neighborhood? Yes, ma'am. Did you ever purchase drugs from Lil Wes? Yeah, I purchased marijuana from him before. And where did you purchase those drugs from him? Out his house on... It was a little block. I forgot the little block. The little block he was staying in. Was it in the vicinity of Green Mountain North? Yes, ma'am. Going to show you government's exhibit PHI 81. Do you recognize this individual? Yes, ma'am. Who is that? Stymie. And is this the same Stymie you mentioned earlier as being a member of the BGF Greenmount regime? Yes, ma'am. Going to show you government's exhibit PHI 30. Do you recognize this individual? Yes, ma'am. Who is it? Mustafa. And based on your interactions with members of the BGF regime there, did you learn whether he was a member of the regime? Yes, ma'am. And was he? Yes, ma'am. Mr. Davis, were members of BGF involved in criminal activities in the Greenmount neighborhood? Yes, ma'am. Were they involved in selling drugs in the neighborhood? Yes, ma'am. Were they involved in committing robberies in the neighborhood? Yes, ma'am. Did you have friends who were robbed by BGF? Yes, ma'am. Did you observe some of those robberies with your own eyes? Yes, ma'am. Can you tell us about those incidents?